Florida's legislature has made numerous assaults against the initiative process. Their most recent is House Bill 5. And one of the key things it does is to ban paying petition circulators on the basis of how many signatures they collect, which is, of course, what anyone who's paying them wants them to do, is collect as many as possible. This is a hearing from a couple of weeks ago where Representative Grant explains why he's trying to do this.
Is there evidence that signatures collected by a person collecting them and they're paid per hour or paid per signature are more fraudulent?
You're recognized.
If you're asking specifically on the petition process, I don't know the answer to that. If you're asking specifically on societal behavior and broken commission plans, Wells Fargo is a fantastic example, where in fact Wells Fargo incentivized their employees based on the number of new accounts created. What they found was a massive amount of fraud that violated your privacy and my privacy, if you have any data at Wells Fargo, with manufactured accounts simply to meet a broken commission program. And so there is plenty of evidence of how broken commission structures will lead to bad actions. And to me, I don't need to wait until I have evidence of fraud. I simply need to find vulnerabilities of fraud to be at peace with protections against those vulnerabilities. To suggest that we have to wait for documented evidence. I mean, members, I find this fascinating. In 2012, we had plenty of warning about what the Russians intended to do, and it was laughed off. And then in 2016, the Russians very clearly and actively played in our election at the presidential level. I don't believe we as legislators should wait until after the fact that harm occurs to get serious about existing vulnerabilities that we know are in fact wide open and vulnerable. I would prefer we get much more proactive about it so that we maybe could put a stop to those things before they happen.
You have a follow-up?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. There were quite a few amendments in 2018. And do you know if the people who gathered the petitions were generally paid by the hour or paid by signature?
Recognized.
I have no idea.
You know, that last statement, I have no idea, which is preceded by I don't know. What he's basically saying is we need to stop this fraud without there being any fraud. And of course, when asked, he can't say anything except Wells Fargo. Well, if you take this to its logical conclusion, Representative Grant should be trying to outlaw every commission sales plan in the state of Florida, which would be disastrous because oftentimes you do need to set some incentives. If you were going to have somebody pick oranges for you, you probably wouldn't say, hey, I'll just pay you $20 an hour and take your time. You would say, I'll pay you X dollars per bushel. And what he's trying to do here with the pay per signature ban, which would actually be a criminal offense. So he would put people in jail for paying someone to go gather 100 signatures and saying, I'll pay you $1,000, $10 a signature, which would be way high, but just hypothetically. And he doesn't have any evidence there's fraud in the process, but he thinks all commission sales are fraudulent. Not really. Not really. He doesn't really think that, because if he really did think that, he wouldn't be talking about petitions. He'd be coming with a law that says all commission sales should be outlawed. He's playing a game. He's tap dancing. What he wants to do is to block the initiative process, because the initiative process does things like term limits that legislators don't like. The legislature in Florida, even though it's a very close Republican-Democratic state, when you see the presidential elections and Senate and governor elections, in the legislature, the Republicans have a huge majority. So if you're a partisan who doesn't believe in good government, or if you're a legislator who doesn't want the people to tell you what to do, then you might be this sort of person who would just want to destroy any democratic check on government. Just get rid of the democratic checks. We don't want that sort of citizen control of government. But even though I suspect I oppose some of the things that have been passed on the ballot in Florida, I don't want to destroy all democratic checks on government. That's insane. That is where the Republican Party is in the legislature in Florida. And it's just absolutely despicable, and it's a little scary. And this idea, I guess Wells Fargo wasn't a good enough boogeyman, so we have to be afraid of the Russians too. If we destroy the initiative process in Florida, somehow that'll get the Russians. So this is silliness, but it's not a funny ha-ha silliness. This is one legislator's belief that he can tap dance his way to destroying an essential check on government in Florida. And the governor, it's on the governor's desk. The governor could sign it. Hopefully it'll be sued, but this could be law very, very quickly in Florida. There was another part of this hearing. In fact, the whole hearing is just full of, well, I'm not allowed to say that word, but the whole hearing has just things that make you cringe and roll your eyes. But his next comment, I think, is worth listening to as well.
Final. So is there any way to know that the signatures with so many people who signed those ballots, voted for the amendments, overwhelmingly, that there was fraud in the petition gathering process?
Recognized.
Your question inherently expresses the need for this legislation because none of us have any idea. None of us have any ability to look back and figure out how something got on our Constitution. Zero. So we just take people's word for it, and then it ends up in our Constitution where it is effectively permanent with very few exceptions.
He really, this is the know-nothing bill of the century. He doesn't even seem to know how something gets not on the Constitution, like it's a stain or you spilled your coffee on the Constitution, but actually in the text of the Constitution. But it's a very simple but arduous process. So he's playing it up that we have no idea what's going on. These measures just get on the ballot. Somehow we're clueless as to how, and they just get in the Constitution. We don't know how. Was there election? Was there not? Who knows? It's impossible to know, except I know, and anybody who reads the statutes or reads the Constitution of Florida knows you have to collect over 750,000 voter signatures to put a measure on in Florida. They have to be distributed throughout the state. I believe you have to qualify in, I think it's 20 congressional districts as well. Those signatures are not just, you threw a pile of signatures on our desk, therefore you're on the ballot, who knows, what can we do? Those signatures are all checked. And of course, they're checked by the petition companies and the petition organizers or the grassroots groups that get volunteers going. They're all checking their signatures to make sure they have enough. Then they turn them over to the state, and the state looks at them and checks the actual signature on the form against the signature on the voter registration form. In all of that process, in literally millions of signatures through the years, Representative Grant can't point to a single case of verified fraud in this process, not a single one. And yet he's ready to put people in prison over doing something that they've been doing all the time. There's no problem. But of course, it's not just getting it on the ballot. Even if someone somehow pulled some miracle fraudulent scheme, like Wells Fargo and the Russians got together and ran a petition drive and just fooled us all, it then goes on the ballot. And there's a campaign. And Americans talk on one side or the other, and they campaign, and we decide. And of course, in Florida, it could be that maybe it was really close, and by 51 to 49%, they put something in the Constitution. Oh, wait. No, that wouldn't work in Florida, because more than a dozen years ago in Florida, they raised, the legislature put on the ballot and claimed the Constitution was being destroyed, and they raised the vote percentage to 60%. A few cycles ago, a medical marijuana measure got over 59% of the vote, but didn't get 60 and failed. Now, of course, last election, it came back and won. it got the 60%. But we're talking about a process in which you have to collect hundreds of thousands of signatures. You have to get those signatures verified to make sure they're not just somebody's signature, they're the actual voter who signed it and who's a registered voter. And then you've got to get a supermajority of 60% to prevail. And he seems to not have any clue as to how that works and thinks it's just too easy. Later in this hearing, the one thing and the only thing that he ever seemed to know about the petition process was that if his bill became law, it would dramatically increase the cost of doing petitions. And of course, that's exactly what he's after. These guys always complain that out-of-state billionaires are controlling things. And then they create a process that basically only billionaires can afford to use. We have been fighting it for years, and it's coming primarily from Republicans because, of course, they've gotten to where they control most of the legislatures in the country, the state legislatures. Before that, it was Democrats. We still have problems in states like California that are overwhelmingly Democrat, where they're passing things to try to block the process. In a state that's overwhelmingly Republican, it's the Republicans who are trying to block the process. We have to, as citizens, get together and say, partisanship, be as partisan as you want, but do not destroy the fundamental pillars of democracy because you want your side to win come hook or by crook. Hear me out here, because it'll take just a minute, but people should realize just how dishonest what he's saying is compared to reality. They complain all the time. In fact, there was a provision in this bill that got stripped out before it got passed that would have required the Supreme Court to have a statement on the ballot saying whether or not this had to be done by constitutional amendment. Because all along, the legislature refused to provide a process whereby citizens can do statutes. So if you want to do something, even though it could be done as a simple statute, it doesn't have to be in the Constitution, you're not likely to do it as a statute because then the legislature can just rip it up. And you don't have that process anyway, except to go through the legislature, which is likely to say no. So there is no statutory process available. He doesn't intend to make one available, and then bemoans that things are being added to the Constitution. But there's more. This last election, there were 11 constitutional amendments on the Florida ballot. Now, I think there's some people listening who might say, wow, that's a lot. There is a problem, Paul. 2 of them were by citizen initiative. The others were put on by the legislature and by a commission that Florida has every so often. I think it's every 20 years. I could be wrong. It could be every 10, but I think it's every 20. And that commission can put stuff on the ballot willy-nilly. That commission is picked by the legislature and the governor. And in other words, if you're a high-profile, politically in person, you can be part of a commission that can just throw all kinds of things up on the ballot. We don't have any problem with that. But if you're just a regular citizen who doesn't know the secret handshake, that didn't get the decoder ring to be able to use democracy, then get the heck out of Dodge is what they're saying. They want to block that process. And so this whole idea of protecting the Constitution is complete baloney. The citizen initiative process has been very reasonable in Florida. And if you were to name some of the things that have been done, I mean, they've got property tax relief in Florida that causes people from all over the country who are wealthy and can have 2 homes to decide, I'm a resident of Florida. They don't have an income tax. They've got tremendous growth. They've got a lot of good things going. They have term limits that passed with 77% of the vote. But even an issue like that, if you think about it, when you've got to get a 60% vote, you really encourage the powerful forces to spend a lot of money and try to beat you. Anyway, that kind of goes on to another issue. But the bottom line is the Florida Constitution is the people's, and they get to decide what goes in it. But if there's any problem about what's being proposed to go into the Constitution, this last election is a good example of how the initiative process isn't the problem. 2 out of the 11 measures on the ballot for voters came from the initiative. The rest came from the legislature and from the legislature's pet little commission that can just simply throw things on the ballot. In fact, the initiative process is also limited by a single subject requirement. While this commission can throw as many amendments on the ballot as it wants, it can also combine them into 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 amendments into one vote. So the whole system is designed to be extremely tough on citizens and easy for the in crowd. And of course, Representative Grant wants to kick citizens out and make it even easier for the in crowd. Absolutely. I mean, it is against the law to sign some signature that's not your own. It's against the law you have to basically pledge that these signatures you're collecting were in your presence and seen by you and so on. So there's already laws on the books that would prevent fraud. What he's trying to do is say this one process, which is the best process to use if you're trying to get a petition drive to gather enough signatures to get on the ballot, can't be used because it's likely to be fraudulent. Well, they've had the petition process since the 70s. He doesn't have a single bit of evidence that there's any fraud. I'm sure somebody somewhere in Florida at some point did something wrong, but Representative Grant doesn't know about it. And so this is not about fraud. Fraud is a word that he gets to use to hoodwink the people of Florida. And frankly, this is a very unpopular piece of legislation. Almost all the people who signed up to testify on it were against it, with the exception of the Chamber of Commerce and powerful interests that don't want any check on their control of the legislature.